Now we're going to backtrack a little bit and go into what happened right after the end of World War II. So it's going to be 1944 and you're going to have the GI Bill of Rights, right? Think of GI Joe, right? GI Joe, so it's going to be for veterans and it's going to encourage education, right? So it's going to give them a year's worth of employment, lowered interest on loans, guarantee them loans, so they can get an education and get back on their feet. So that's going to be the GI Bill of Rights in 1944. Now, also after World War II, you're going to have the growth of the suburbs, right? What is a suburb? These are cities, small little towns outside of the city, right? William Levitt and Henry Kaiser were the creators of these suburbs, and they created cookie cutter houses. One of them bragged that they can make a house in 15 minutes. So whenever you go into neighborhoods that they all look the same, it's because they have the same plan, the same format, meaning it's going to be faster and easier to make them. It's kind of like what Henry Ford did with the car. This is going to be an assembly line method to mass produce houses, right? And here you can see how the houses or the homes look very similar, right? They look exactly the same. Now, President Truman, after World War II, he dealt with two major problems: the rising communist threat, of course, and restoring a strong economy. He's a huge supporter of civil rights. Jackie Robinson was the first African American to be a pro baseball player, right? And in 1948, President Truman integrated the armed forces. So World War II was the last war that was segregated or separated, and we saw that with the Tuskegee Airmen and the separation between the races in the war. So here you can see them all together. Now, Dixiecrats are another problem that Truman had to face. It's people from the South who opposed Truman's civil rights laws, right? People who were against civil rights, and of course, mainly they're going to be in the South. Now, Dewey was the person that he went against, and a lot of people believed that Truman was going to be defeated by Dewey, and it doesn't happen. So here, of course, Truman is a little weird. You see him showing off the newspaper that says Dewey defeats Truman. It was very close, and Truman ended up pulling out the win. And Truman called his policy the Fair Deal, which extends FDR's New Deal, right? So FDR has the New Deal, Teddy Roosevelt has the Square Deal, and Truman has the Fair Deal. So now when Eisenhower takes over, he goes off of this not policy, but like a slogan, I like Ike, right? Dwight Ike D. Eisenhower. So he takes over. The United States was ready for a Republican change, and they blamed the Democrats for the rise in communism, right? They blamed the Democrats. And Richard M. Nixon was his vice president, right? Richard Nixon was the vice president for Eisenhower. Now, the American dream in the 1950s, you're going to have franchises like McDonald's, right, with the creation of the drive-thru, and you have the baby boom, most kids born from 1940 to 1960. We'll go over that in class. Dr. Jonas Salk created vaccines for like polio. Betty Friedan, the feminine mystique. The role of women after World War II, how that changed. So in the 1940s, women were working in factories, but in the 1950s, they became housewives again. So it's going to criticize the role of women after the war. Automania was needed to transport people to the suburbs, right? So cars become a big deal again. We're seeing the same effect that we saw after World War I, into the 1920s. So you're going to have this huge, upbringing, economic growth in the 1950s. And you have the creation of the interstate highway system. It was created by Eisenhower, and because of that, now you have the decline in the use of railroads. In Europe, Eisenhower was exposed to the highway systems, and he wanted to bring that idea to the United States, which he did. And consumerism, it's a new technology where you have less labor, more leisure. So just like we saw in the 1920s with all these new, let's say, vacuums and washing machines, you're going to have the same with the 1950s. You're going to have the creation of like toasters, refrigerators, you're going to have ovens, and a lot more things are going to be more convenient. So consumerism is on the rise. The last thing you're going to have is pop culture. You're going to have mass media, right? Television becomes a big deal now. TV shows, I Love Lucy, westerns, advertisements, commercials, those are big hits now. Film, right? Wide angle movies. You have smell-o-vision all of a sudden. And radio. You have the beat movement, which had little structure. You have Jack Kerouac on the road. Rock and roll, of course, Elvis Presley. Jazz, Nat King Cole and Billie Holiday, right? So you're going to have this new era, just like what we saw in the 1920s, right? Another artistic revival. If you have any questions, you let me know.